The scent of history and decay clung to her like a second skin. Turpentine, linseed oil, and the dry, dusty breath of centuries-old canvas filled the small, sun-drenched restoration studio at the university. Clara, at 22, moved with a reverence that seemed beyond her years, her delicate fingers hovering over the cracked surface of a 17th-century portrait. Her touch was a whisper, a promise to mend what time had broken. She saw herself in the intricate web of fissures spidering across the painted lady's stoic face, a life held together by a fragile, invisible lattice of duty and quiet resignation. Every canvas she healed was a piece of her own soul she couldn't yet reach, a vibrant world of color and passion trapped beneath a yellowed varnish of fear and responsibility. Her own life felt like an old painting, waiting for a touch that might restore its lost brilliance. If you want to discover what cracks lie beneath Clara's own carefully preserved surface, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. Let's continue. Her existence was a carefully constructed diptych, split between two starkly different realities. One panel depicted her cramped Oakland apartment, a place of worn furniture, and the lingering scent of her mother's herbal teas, a constant reminder of the illness that had stolen her late teens. The other panel showed the sterile, architectural perfection of Atherton, where she worked as a nanny to fund her studies and support the very family that tethered her. Clara was the silent bridge between these two worlds, a ghost who drifted across the bay each day, leaving a piece of herself behind on either side. She was a scholar of art, but a novice at life, her hands skilled at mending the past but clumsy and uncertain when it came to forging a future of her own choosing. Her youth was not a vibrant landscape, but a preparatory sketch, filled with faint lines she was too afraid to commit to. Ink. The loneliness was a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of her days. It was in the hollow echo of her footsteps as she walked home from the bus stop late at night, the city lights blurring into a watercolor of lives she wasn't living. She heard the laughter of her peers spilling out from bars and cafes, a language she didn't speak, tales of dates and heartbreaks that felt like fiction from a distant land. Her world was circumscribed by the needs of others, her mother's fragile health, her younger brother's tuition, and the emotional equilibrium of the little girl she cared for. This devotion had become her shield, a noble purpose that excused her from the terrifying vulnerability of wanting something for herself. The void within her wasn't born of tragedy but of absence, the slow, creeping emptiness of a life lived entirely in the service of love given, but never truly received for herself. Her innocence was not a choice, but a consequence, a garden untended. At 22, her body was a landscape yet to be discovered, her heart a room whose door had never been opened. Virginity for her was not a moral declaration, but the quiet result of a life spent holding her breath. The boys she'd known in high school had been loud and clumsy, and she, ever the observer, had retreated further into her shell. In college, the weight of her responsibilities made the very idea of romance feel like a reckless indulgence, a luxury she couldn't afford. Desire was an abstract concept, something she read about in novels or saw in the passionate gazes of figures in Renaissance art. It was a fire she instinctively knew could either warm her or burn her world to the ground, and so she remained in the cold, where it was safe, where nothing could touch her, and where she was beginning to fear she would feel nothing at all. The Vance's mansion in Atherton was less a home and more a monument to emptiness. It was a cathedral of glass and polished concrete, where sunlight seemed to lose its warmth the moment it passed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Every surface was immaculate, every piece of minimalist furniture placed with algorithmic precision. The silence in the vast, echoing hallways was profound, broken only by the soft padding of her own footsteps or the distant melodic chatter of 7-year-old Sophia. Clara felt like an anomaly there, a smudge of warm, organic life in a sterile, digital world. The stark contrast between this cold opulence and her own cluttered, lived-in existence was a daily reminder of the chasm that separated her from the world of power and privilege she served. She was the caretaker of a life, a child, within a house that felt utterly devoid of it. Her connection with Sophia was the one authentic, vibrant thread in the muted tapestry of her life. The little girl, with her father's serious eyes and a spirit that refused to be subdued by the house's oppressive silence, was a small, fierce flame. Clara would spend hours with her in the manicured gardens, telling her stories of mythical creatures and brave queens, her voice weaving worlds of magic to counteract the sterile reality around them. In Sophia's innocent questions and fierce hugs, Clara found a reflection of the unconditional affection she craved. She was more than a nanny. She was a storyteller, a confidant, a substitute for the maternal warmth that was conspicuously absent. This bond was her anchor, the one pure thing in a life of compromise, and she loved the child with a fierce, protective instinct that was beginning to feel dangerously like her own. Some evenings after Sophia was asleep and the house fell into its deep technological slumber, Clara would stand before the massive glass walls overlooking the distant, glittering lights of the city. She would press her palm against the cool, unyielding surface, her own faint reflection staring back at her, a pale, translucent figure superimposed against a world she could see but never join. She felt trapped between the panes, a ghost in a billionaire's mausoleum. She knew nothing of the man who owned this house, Adrian Vance, other than the fact that he was a powerful, reclusive genius, the architect of this beautiful, empty cage. His absence was a palpable presence, a shadow that stretched into every corner of the home, and she was beginning to feel its chill seep into her own bones, unaware that the shadow was about to acquire a form. The daily commute was a ritual of dislocation, a physical severing of her two selves. Each morning began in the pre-dawn chill of Oakland, the air thick with the scent of damp pavement and diesel from the early buses. She'd walk past murals bursting with defiant color, life spilling from every crack in the concrete, a world of texture and sound that was both home and a constant reminder of her limitations. Then came the sterile metallic hum of the BART train, hurtling her under the bay. Emerging on the peninsula was like stepping onto another planet. The air in Atherton was different, cleaner, quieter, scented with jasmine and chlorine from unseen swimming pools. The transition was a slow erasure of self. By the time she stepped onto the manicured grounds of the Vance estate, the vibrant, struggling girl from Oakland had been carefully packed away, replaced by the quiet, efficient ghost who haunted the halls of a billionaire's mansion. Her apartment was a testament to a life lived on the margins, a collection of inherited furniture and carefully mended belongings. The small two-bedroom space she shared with her mother and younger brother felt crowded with the weight of unspoken anxieties. A stack of bills, a mix of medical statements and student loan notices, held a permanent, ominous place on the small kitchen counter, a paper monument to their precarity. The air was perpetually infused with the cloying, sweet smell of the herbal tinctures her mother brewed, a scent Clara now associated not with healing, but with the suffocating nature of her obligations. Every object in the apartment, the threadbare armchair where her mother rested, the chipped mug she drank her morning coffee from, seemed to whisper the same word to her: duty. It was not a sanctuary, but a cage built of love and necessity, and its walls were closing in. Her mother, Maria, was a woman forged in fragility, her long illness having left behind a residue of quiet, pervasive need. She never raised her voice or made direct demands, but her power was absolute, wielded through sighs of fatigue and gentle, guilt-laden reminders of Clara's goodness. "I don't know what we would do without you, Mia," she would say, her hand resting on Clara's arm, the touch both an expression of love and the locking of a manacle. Maria's dreams for her daughter were small, safe and suffocating: a stable job nearby, a respectable marriage to a local boy who would understand their situation. She saw Clara's talent for art not as a passion to be pursued, but as a quaint hobby, secondary to the real serious business of keeping the family afloat. Her love was a heavy blanket, offering warmth, but smothering the flames of Clara's own nascent desires. The numbers were a language of dread that Clara had become fluent in. She would sit at the wobbly kitchen table late at night, long after the rest of the apartment had fallen silent, and stare at the statements under the dim light. The balance on her student loans felt like a mountain she could never climb. The lingering medical debts from her mother's treatment were a swamp, threatening to pull them all under with every new envelope that arrived. Her paycheck from the Vances, which seemed like a fortune to her family, vanished almost as soon as it was deposited, swallowed by rent, tuition payments, and groceries. This financial pressure was a constant, low-grade fever, shaping every decision she made. It was the reason she said no to coffee with classmates, the reason she wore clothes until they were threadbare, and the reason the idea of a future defined by her own choices felt like an impossible fantasy. She was the good daughter, a role she had perfected over years of practice. It was a performance that had begun during her mother's illness, when she had learned to suppress her own teenage fears to become a pillar of strength. Now, the role was her identity. Her family's praise was the currency of her sacrifice. "Clara is so responsible," her aunt would say during family gatherings. "She thinks of everyone else before herself." Each compliment was a stone added to the wall around her heart, reinforcing the idea that her value lay in her selflessness. She had become so adept at anticipating and meeting the needs of others that she had forgotten how to listen for her own. The approval she received was addictive, a comforting validation that masked the terrifying emptiness of a life that wasn't truly hers, a life lived in service to an image. She felt she could never escape. The university campus was a world she visited, but never truly inhabited. She would walk through the bustling student union, an invisible observer watching a vibrant tableau of lives she couldn't comprehend. She saw groups of students laughing over textbooks, their conversations punctuated with plans for the weekend, complaints about dates, and dreams of backpacking through Europe. For them, college was a time of exploration and reckless discovery. For Clara, it was a transaction, a series of classes she needed to pass to secure a future that would allow her to continue her duties. The loneliness was most acute here, surrounded by people her own age. She was a ghost in their midst, her youth a currency she was spending on someone else's debts, and she felt the chasm between her reality and theirs growing wider with every passing day. Her mother's vision for her future was a meticulously crafted, modestly framed picture. In it, Clara married a man like their neighbor's son David, a kind, steady mechanic who had shown a quiet interest in her. They would live a few blocks away, close enough for Sunday dinners and for Clara to check in on her mother daily. She would get a secure job, perhaps as a high school art teacher, something practical and safe. This narrative was woven into their conversations with subtle persistence. "David asked about you again," her mother would mention casually, her eyes holding a hopeful gleam. This pressure wasn't cruel. It was born of a deep-seated fear of the unknown. For Maria, Clara's artistic ambitions were a dangerous, unpredictable path. She wanted her daughter anchored, safe from the storms of passion and uncertainty that she believed had nearly broken her own life. The restoration studio, once her only true sanctuary, was beginning to feel like another gilded cage. The scent of oil paint and old varnish was the smell of her only freedom, yet that freedom came at an exorbitant price. As she meticulously cleaned the grime from a centuries-old canvas, her mind would drift to the invoice for her tuition. The very act of pursuing her passion was what chained her to the sterile, soulless mansion in Atherton. The delicate instruments in her hands, capable of mending the broken past, felt useless when it came to her own fractured present. The art she loved was both her escape and the justification for her imprisonment. It was a beautiful, tragic paradox. To save the art, she had to sacrifice her life, and she was beginning to wonder if the trade was worth it. A bitter, unfamiliar resentment had begun to curdle beneath her placid surface. It was a quiet, internal rebellion, manifesting in small, sharp pangs of envy. She felt it when she saw Sophia's room, overflowing with toys and beautiful clothes, a childhood of effortless abundance so different from her own. She felt it when she overheard other nannies in the park discussing their upcoming vacations, their lives seeming so much lighter, so unburdened. One afternoon, while pushing Sophia on a swing, she watched a young couple kissing on a nearby bench, lost in their own world. A hot, sharp feeling, part anger, part longing, shot through her, so intense it made her gasp. It was the first tremor of a seismic shift within her, the dawning realization that her self-sacrifice was not just noble, but a profound and devastating theft of her own life. The journey home each evening was a descent, a slow return to the crushing gravity of her reality. As the bus rumbled back across the Bay Bridge, the glittering skyline of San Francisco seemed to mock her. It was a city of infinite possibilities, all of them out of reach. She would watch the lights blur through the grimy window, feeling the day's exhaustion settle deep into her bones. It wasn't just a physical tiredness, but a soul-deep weariness from the constant performance, the endless code-switching between her two lives. Stepping off the bus in Oakland, the familiar sounds and smells that had once meant comfort now felt like the closing of a cell door. She would walk the final blocks to her apartment, the weight of another day pressing down, knowing that tomorrow would be exactly the same, a perfect repeating loop of quiet desperation. He arrived not with a sound, but with a shift in the very atmosphere of the house. One late afternoon, the oppressive silence of the mansion didn't just feel empty, it became heavy, charged with a latent energy. Like the air before a storm, the smart home systems seemed to hum with a different frequency, the lights adjusting with an unseen intentionality. Clara felt it first as a subtle chill on her skin, a primal sense of being watched. Adrian Vance was a ghost in the global machine of technology, but in his own home he was a god, and his return was not an entrance, but a materialization. The staff, a skeleton crew she rarely saw, moved with a new, hushed urgency. The legend of the Silicon Monk was no longer an abstract concept. His presence was a gravitational force, bending the sterile environment around a core of cold, silent power she had yet to witness. Adrian Vance existed in a self-imposed exile within walls of his own design. He retreated to his study, a dark sanctum where the only light emanated from a wall of monitors displaying cascading lines of code, fluctuating market data, and satellite imagery. This digital fortress was his shield against the messy, unpredictable chaos of human emotion. He could command empires from this chair, yet he couldn't bear the weight of the silence in the hallway outside his daughter's room. On a secondary screen, almost hidden behind a stock ticker, was a single photograph. A woman with a vibrant, laughing smile, and a little girl with the same serious eyes as his. He would stare at it for precisely 10 seconds each day, a ritual of self-flagellation. He wasn't merely cold, he was a man who had surgically removed his own heart to stop the bleeding, and now lived in the sterile, hollowed-out cavity that remained. Unaware of the shift in the house's polarity, Clara was finishing her day in Sophia's room, a whimsical pastel island in the vast ocean of grey and white. She had just finished reading a story about a lost star finding its way home, and now as she tucked the blankets around the little girl, she began to hum a soft Spanish lullaby her grandmother used to sing. It was a simple, ancient melody, a thread of warmth and tradition woven into the cold, modern air. The notes were a whisper of a life lived with feeling, of scraped knees and shared meals, of a love that was tangible and messy, not an algorithm to be optimized. In that moment, she wasn't just a nanny, she was a conduit for a kind of simple human tenderness that the house itself seemed engineered to reject, a quiet act of rebellion against the crushing emptiness. The faint melodic sound pierced the hermetic seal of Adrian's study. It was an anomaly, an unquantifiable piece of data that his mind couldn't immediately categorize or dismiss. It was organic, flawed, and utterly human. It drew him from his chair, his movements silent and fluid, a predator drawn by an unfamiliar scent. He moved through the darkened hallway, his bare feet making no sound on the polished concrete floor. He stopped in the shadows just beyond Sophia's doorway, which was cracked open just enough to let a sliver of warm light spill out. Through that crack, he saw her. He saw the gentle curve of her back as she leaned over his daughter, her hand stroking Sophia's hair, and he heard the source of the sound, that soft, heartbreakingly pure lullaby. He didn't see an employee. He saw an intrusion of light into his carefully curated darkness. He stepped from the shadows, his form resolving into a tall, severe silhouette against the dim light of the hall. Clara finished her song, her hand lingering on Sophia's head for a moment before she quietly rose and turned to leave the room. She saw him then, and her breath caught in her throat. He was not what she had imagined. The few photos she'd seen online were sterile corporate headshots that did nothing to capture the raw, coiled intensity of his presence. He was built like a man who had methodically stripped away everything non-essential, sharp lines, lean muscle, a face carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a pale, Arctic grey, intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth, and they looked at her not as if she were a person, but a problem he was trying to solve. The silence that stretched between them was a physical entity, a chasm of class, power, and experience. She could hear the frantic drumming of her own heart against her ribs, a wild, terrified bird beating against its cage. He didn't offer a greeting, no polite preamble to soften the encounter. His power was in his economy of motion, of expression, of words. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone, as devoid of inflection as the rest of him. "Who are you?" he asked. The question was not an inquiry. It was a challenge, a demand for her to justify her presence, her warmth, her very existence within the sterile confines of his world. He wasn't just asking for her name. He was asking what she was doing, breathing life into a space he had deliberately left to die. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She was pinned by his gaze, feeling utterly exposed, as if he could see every frayed thread of her second-hand clothes, every penny of her student debt, every secret fear she kept locked away. Her voice, when she finally found it, was barely audible, a fragile whisper in the vast, echoing hall. "I'm Clara," she managed, her throat tight. "I'm Sophia's nanny." The words sounded pathetic, inadequate. She was suddenly and painfully aware of the immense distance between them, not just the physical space in the hallway, but the galaxies that separated their lives. He was the architect of this universe, and she was just a temporary, insignificant satellite caught in his orbit, and his stare made her feel as if she were about to burn up on re-entry. He held her gaze for a beat too long, and in that protracted silence, the dynamic shifted. His expression remained a mask of cold neutrality, but something flickered deep within those winter-grey eyes. It wasn't lust or even interest. It was something far more unnerving, a flash of profound, almost painful recognition. It was as if his analytical mind, which saw the world in patterns and code, had momentarily bypassed her social standing and her role as an employee, and had instead registered the fine, invisible cracks in her composure. He saw the quiet resignation, the carefully contained sorrow, the loneliness she thought was her own private secret. For a dizzying second, the billionaire genius looked at the poor art student and saw not an inferior, but a mirror reflecting a different kind of imprisonment. One. Moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. His eyes went flat, the mask of indifference sliding perfectly back into place. He gave a single sharp nod, a dismissal, not an acknowledgement. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his study, his silhouette dissolving back into the shadows from which it had emerged. He left behind a vacuum in the air, a sudden ringing silence that was more profound than the quiet that had preceded him. Clara stood frozen in the hallway, her hand pressed against her chest as if to still her racing heart. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, but it had completely rewired her sense of place, leaving her feeling more exposed and unsettled than she had ever felt in her life. She finally sagged against the cool, smooth wall, her legs trembling. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the sterile air feeling thick and hard to draw into her lungs. She had known the abstract idea of Adrian Vance, the reclusive titan of industry, but she had just met the man, and the reality was a force of nature. It was a cold, quiet storm, and she had just stood in its eye. He had said almost nothing, and yet she felt as if they had engaged in a deep, intimate, and terrifying conversation. He had looked at her and seen her, the girl hidden beneath the layers of duty and responsibility. A seed of something dangerous and utterly magnetic had been planted in the fertile ground of her loneliness, and she had the terrifying premonition that, in the barren world of Adrian Vance, it would be the only thing to ever grow. The ghost of their first encounter lingered in the mansion's sterile air, transforming its silence from a mere absence of sound into a palpable, waiting presence. Clara found herself moving through the vast empty spaces with a new, heightened awareness, her senses tuned to a frequency she hadn't known existed. Every subtle creak of the floorboards, every distant hum from the server room, might be him. She would pause while dusting a minimalist sculpture, her head tilted, listening for the soft, soundless tread of his bare feet on the polished concrete. This constant, low-grade anticipation was a form of torment, a tightening wire of suspense that left her perpetually on edge. The house was no longer just an empty vessel. It was his territory, and she was an intruder who had been seen, an anomaly he was now aware of. and she felt his unseen gaze tracking her every move. Their second meeting was a study in controlled tension, taking place in the vast chrome and marble kitchen that looked more like a laboratory than a place for preparing food. He materialized as she was cutting apple slices for Sophia, his presence so sudden and silent it made her flinch, the knife momentarily stilling in her hand. He didn't greet her, moving instead with an unnerving economy of motion toward the espresso machine. But she felt his eyes on her, not on her face, but on her hands, the delicate, capable fingers that mended priceless art, now performing the simple domestic task of feeding his child. It was a heavy, analytical gaze, as if he were trying to deconstruct the very essence of her tenderness, to understand its mechanics. Under his silent scrutiny, the simple act of arranging fruit on a plate felt intensely intimate, a profound and unnerving exposure of her inner self. From the dark, tinted glass of his study that overlooked the manicured lawns, Adrian began to watch her. It became a private, obsessive ritual. He would see her with Sophia in the garden, her head bent close to his daughter's, her voice carrying on the breeze as she wove intricate stories about the shapes of the clouds. He saw her patience, a quality he had long since coded out of his own operating system. He saw a natural, unforced warmth that felt like a memory from a forgotten life. This was not the leering of a man interested in an employee. It was the pained, meticulous study of a scientist observing a phenomenon he could not replicate or understand. She was an equation he couldn't solve, a living, breathing refutation of the cold, hard logic by which he had meticulously rebuilt his broken world, and her light was beginning to cast long, unfamiliar shadows in his. Clara, in turn, became a performer on an invisible stage. She could feel the weight of his observation as a physical pressure between her shoulder blades, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that signaled she was no longer alone. When she knelt to tie Sophia's shoelace or pushed her on the swing, she was acutely conscious of the unseen audience in the glass tower. This awareness made her movements more deliberate, her smiles slightly more brittle. A strange, internal conflict brewed within her. One part of her resented the intrusion, the silent judgment of this powerful, enigmatic man. Yet, another, more dangerous part of her began to respond to it. She found herself wanting to show him the best of herself, her gentleness, her creativity, as if seeking a silent, impossible approval from the cold grey eyes she knew were watching from the shadows. One evening, long after Sophia was asleep, she found him in the kitchen, a stark silhouette against the cold blue light of the smart refrigerator. He looked different without the armor of the day. His shoulders were slumped with a weariness that seemed bone-deep, his face etched with exhaustion. For the first time, he initiated a conversation that wasn't a command. "Art? Restoration," he stated, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Why that?" Caught off guard, Clara spoke with an uncharacteristic honesty, explaining her love for finding the life trapped beneath layers of dirt and time, the patient act of mending what was broken. As she spoke, she saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded in his eyes, and she realized with a jolt that she wasn't just talking about paintings anymore. The air grew thick with the unspoken subtext of their words. He held her, gaze the cold mask of the billionaire momentarily dissolving to reveal the man beneath. "My wife," he said, the words sounding rusty, as if they hadn't been used in years. She loved the pre-Raphaelites, the tragic romance of it all. It was a shard of his past, offered up with no context, yet it was more revealing than anything she could have imagined. In that single, painful admission, he ceased to be a monster or a mystery. He became a man defined by a profound loss, a man still living in the wreckage of a past tragedy. This unexpected vulnerability was a far more potent and dangerous weapon than his power or his wealth. It bypassed all her defenses, striking a chord of empathy so deep it felt like a betrayal of her own carefully guarded heart, drawing her closer to the very pain she had spent her life trying to avoid. The slow-burning tension finally found a physical flashpoint. In the narrow hallway leading to the library, they turned a corner at the same moment, moving to pass each other in the tight space. As he stepped aside, the back of his hand brushed against hers. The contact was fleeting, accidental, yet it sent a bolt of white-hot electricity through her entire body. It was as if she had touched a live wire. They both froze, their eyes locking in a moment of shared shock. The air between them crackled, suddenly charged with a new, terrifying energy. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, his jaw tightening, a muscle twitching in his cheek. No apology was offered, no word spoken. They simply stood there, breathing in the charged silence, the invisible line between employer and employee irrevocably, incandescently erased. Clara's inner world became a battleground. The memory of his touch, of that brief, scorching contact, was branded onto her skin. Back in her small Oakland apartment, surrounded by the familiar scent of her mother's herbal teas and the weight of her responsibilities, his image was an invasive presence. She would close her eyes and see his arctic gaze, feel the phantom heat of his hand against hers. This burgeoning obsession was a terrifying form of treason. He was everything she was supposed to fear, a world of cold, untouchable power, of complicated grief and moral ambiguity. The nascent desire she felt was a direct violation of the sacred role she played, the good, selfless daughter. To want something for herself, especially something so dangerous and complicated, felt like the ultimate act of selfishness, a betrayal of the family she had sacrificed everything to protect. In a desperate act of self-preservation, she tried to rebuild the walls he had breached. She retreated into a fortress of professionalism, her interactions with him becoming clipped, formal, and meticulously impersonal. She avoided his gaze, kept her answers brief, and made herself scarce whenever he was near. She tried to become a ghost in his house once more, a functional, invisible part of the machinery. She hoped that by denying the connection, by starving it of the oxygen of interaction, it would simply wither and die. She needed to believe she was still in control, that she could choose to step back from the precipice. But her withdrawal was not a retreat. It was the pulling back of a slingshot, only serving to increase the tension, creating a taut, unbearable strain that she knew with sickening certainty was destined to snap. Her calculated distance did not go unnoticed. To a man like Adrian, who processed the world through patterns and data, her sudden shift in behavior was a glaring deviation from the baseline. It did not push him away. It intrigued him. It was a new puzzle to solve. He began to deliberately engineer encounters, his actions a subtle, strategic countermove to her retreat. He started joining her and Sophia for dinner, a radical departure from his routine that left the household staff whispering. Seated at the opposite end of the long, sterile dining table, he would direct questions at her, his voice calm but his eyes issuing a silent challenge. He was forcing her out of the shadows, refusing to let her become invisible again, and with every pointed question, he was testing the strength of the professional facade she was so desperately trying to maintain. It was Sophia, in her childish innocence, who finally shattered the fragile truce. During one of these tense, silent dinners, the little girl looked from Clara to her father and announced brightly, "Clara tells the best stories. Daddy? She makes the house feel like it's smiling." The simple, profound observation landed in the cavernous room with the force of a physical blow. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the child's unwitting indictment of his life. Adrian's gaze flew to Clara, and in that unguarded moment she saw it all. The crushing guilt, the profound loneliness, and a flicker of something that looked devastatingly like hope. Her heart constricted with a wave of empathy so powerful it felt like pain. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was a witness to his brokenness, and that knowledge made her dangerously complicit. The dilemma solidified within her, sharp and unavoidable. This was no longer just a dangerous attraction to a powerful man. It was a deep emotional entanglement with a fractured family. She had fallen in love with Sophia, and that love now made her vulnerable to the child's father. She was beginning to see the man behind the myth, and the profound pity she felt for him was starting to twist into something deeper, something warmer and far more terrifying. To give in to these feelings would be to step willingly into his world, to accept a place in the beautiful, empty cage. It would mean sacrificing the last vestiges of her own simple, controlled life for a future of unpredictable emotional turmoil. It was a choice between the safety of her prison and the terrifying freedom of his. A war raged within her, pitting a lifetime of conditioned self-denial against a raw, primal wanting she had never known. The fear was a cold, familiar weight in her stomach, but the desire was something new, a hot, insistent current pulling her toward him. She began to notice the small, human details she had previously ignored. The way a single lock of dark hair fell across his forehead when he was concentrating, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the sheer, raw intelligence that burned behind his cold facade. For the first time in her 22 years, she wanted. She wanted to know what lay behind his walls. She wanted to be the one to ease the tension in his jaw. She wanted to feel the shocking heat of his touch again. This desire was a terrifying, exhilarating rebellion, a whisper of a life she might actually choose for herself. A violent thunderstorm descended upon the peninsula one night, the kind that rattled the very foundations of the hills. The power grid flickered and died, and the Vance mansion, for all its technological superiority, was plunged into a primal echoing darkness. Emergency generators hummed to life, casting long, distorted shadows, but the home's soul, its network of screens and automated systems, was silent. The storm had stripped the house of its sterile perfection, rendering it vulnerable and raw. Trapped by the deluge, Clara felt a strange sense of liberation in the oppressive darkness. The roles and rules that governed their lives seemed to dissolve with the fading light, leaving only two. People alone in a vast, shadowed space, the tempest outside a perfect echo of the one brewing within. She found him not in front of a screen, but standing before the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of his study, watching the lightning tear jagged holes in the night sky. In the intermittent strobing flashes, he looked less like a titan of industry and more like a solitary king surveying a ruined kingdom. He turned as she entered, his face a mask of shadows. Without a word, he poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the amber liquid glowing in the dim emergency light, and handed one to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. In the shared darkness, protected by the roar of the storm, they began to talk. The words were quiet, stripped of all pretense, the raw, honest exchange of 2 prisoners sharing the confines of the same cell, each recognizing the other's sentence. He moved to stand beside her at the window, their shoulders almost touching. The proximity was dizzying. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin mixed with the peat of the whiskey. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the storm, but his next words were aimed directly at her heart. "You shouldn't be here, Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a warning, spoken with the desperate urgency of a man trying to save her from himself. It was an admission of his own darkness and a recognition of her light. In that moment, he laid his brokenness at her feet, leaving her poised on the terrifying brink of a decision, to flee from the wreckage or to stay and try to piece him back together. His warning hung in the air between them, a final, fragile barrier meant to protect her, but Clara heard it not as a command to retreat, but as a confession of his own profound damage. In the stark, strobing light of the storm, she saw the truth of him, a man so terrified of feeling anything again that he would rather live in a self-imposed purgatory. A lifetime of putting others' needs first had taught her to recognize the shape of unspoken pain, and his was a chasm. The fear she should have felt was eclipsed by a fierce, unfamiliar wave of resolve. Fleeing was the safe, sensible choice, the path of the good daughter. But for the first time in her life, she felt the magnetic pull of a different choice, the one that led not away from the storm, but directly into its heart. She took a single, deliberate step toward him, the sound of her shoe on the concrete floor a soft, declarative sound in the roaring silence between thunderclaps. The space between them, once a universe of social and economic distance, shrank to a few feet of charged, breathable air. Her gaze never left his, and she watched as his mask of cold indifference began to fracture under the intensity of her approach. His jaw was a hard, tight line, his arctic eyes wide with a flicker of something she could only interpret as sheer panic. He was a fortress under siege, and her quiet, determined advance was the one weapon his defenses were not built to withstand. She was no longer the frightened Nanny. She was a woman claiming a territory she hadn't known she wanted until this very moment. Reaching him, she lifted a trembling hand, not in hesitation, but with the slow, reverent purpose of her work. Her fingers, accustomed to tracing the delicate cracks in ancient masterpieces, came to rest against the hard line of his jaw. The contact was an explosion of sensation, the rough texture of his 5 o'clock shadow against her soft fingertips, the surprising, radiating heat of his skin, the rigid tension of the muscle beneath. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath the only sound he made, but he did not pull away. He stood perfectly still, a statue of controlled chaos, and she felt the tremor that ran through him, a seismic shock traveling from his body directly into hers. In that single transgressive touch, she had breached the final wall, stepping past the point of no return. He closed his eyes, a gesture of such profound, unexpected surrender that it stole her breath. It was a white flag raised over a ruined city, an admission of defeat. His entire body remained rigid, coiled with a tension that spoke of years of self-denial, yet his face, under her gentle touch, softened into an expression of raw, unbearable agony. She felt the fight drain out of him, replaced by a vulnerability so stark and absolute it felt sacred. For a man who controlled empires with a keystroke, this simple act of allowing himself to be touched seemed to cost him everything. She saw him not as the billionaire, not as her employer, but as a man who had been starving for a gentle human connection, a man dying of a thirst he had forgotten how to name. An instinct older than reason, deeper than fear, took over. It was the culmination of 22 years of suppressed longing, of a life lived in the pale shades of duty. She rose onto her toes, her other hand coming up to cup his face, her body leaning into his. The world narrowed to the space of a single breath. She could smell the whiskey on his lips, a scent of peat and fire, mingled with the clean, sharp scent that was uniquely his. The rain lashed against the vast glass wall, a frantic, percussive heartbeat that matched the wild drumming in her own chest. In the dim, pulsing emergency light, she saw the faint sheen of moisture on his eyelids and knew with a certainty that shook her to her core that this was not a mistake. It was an inevitability. The first touch of their lips was not a gentle meeting, but a cataclysmic collision. It was a release of every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every moment of unbearable tension that had arced between them. For Clara, it was a supernova, the birth of a universe of feeling in the void of her inexperience. The shock of it, the sheer reality of his mouth on hers, was overwhelming, warm, firm, and tasting of whiskey, and a sorrow so deep it felt like it could drown her. All the carefully constructed walls of her life, the good daughter, the responsible student, the quiet observer, crumbled into dust in that single shattering moment of contact. She wasn't restoring a painting, she was being broken open, and the colors that rushed out were terrifying and brilliant. His control snapped. A sound tore from his throat, a rough guttural groan of a man pushed past. His breaking point. His hands, which had been frozen at his sides, came up to grip her waist, the hold not gentle or possessive, but desperate, anchoring. He pulled her flush against him, and the kiss deepened, transforming from a moment of shock into an act of raw, frantic need. It wasn't the kiss of a lover, but of a starving man, a drowning man. He was kissing her as if he were trying to breathe her in, to absorb the life and warmth she possessed. In his desperate, clumsy passion, she felt the full crushing weight of his loneliness, the years of self-inflicted exile, and the ghost of a love he had never managed to mourn. When the kiss finally broke, they were both breathless, their foreheads pressed together in the suffocating intimacy of the aftermath. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath with them. She kept her eyes closed, her hands still cradling his face, her thumbs stroking the tense skin of his temples. He was trembling, his breathing ragged and uneven. When she finally found the courage to look at him, the arctic grey of his eyes was gone, replaced by a churning, turbulent sea of emotion. She saw everything there, the guilt, the grief, the terrifying hope. He looked at her as if he had never truly seen another human being before, his gaze stripped of all its power and defenses, leaving only the raw, wounded core of the man he had tried so hard to bury. He didn't speak for a long time, the only sound their harsh breathing and the distant rumble of the dying storm. Then his voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whisper, a sound so ravaged by emotion it was almost unrecognizable. "Clara," he breathed, and her name on his lips was not a word, but a prayer and a curse entwined. It was a question and an answer, a plea and a surrender. It was the sound of a man who had built an impenetrable fortress around his heart, only to watch as the one person he had warned away walked through the gates without ever breaking down the door. In that single, shattered utterance of her name, he laid the entire ruined kingdom of his soul at her feet. She gave him no words of comfort, no empty promises that everything would be all right. She knew instinctively that what he needed was not a savior, but a witness. In response, she simply tightened her embrace, holding him there in the wreckage of the moment. It was an act of profound, silent acceptance. She was not afraid of his darkness. She had lived her own life in the shadows. The transgression was complete, an irrevocable act that had redrawn the map of both their worlds. She had stepped into his cage, but in doing so, she had also handed him the key to her own. The storm had passed, but inside the glass walls of the mansion, the real tempest had only just begun. The dawn that followed the storm was an act of cruel clinical precision. The world outside the mansion's glass walls was washed clean, the sky a pale, fragile blue, and inside the house had reset itself with an unnerving efficiency. The emergency lights were off, the network was humming, and the oppressive, intelligent silence had returned, erasing any evidence of the raw, chaotic humanity that had briefly erupted within it. Adrian was gone. Not just from the study, but from the house, from the country. A curt, impersonal email from a disembodied assistant had informed the staff of an urgent, unscheduled trip to Asia. He had vanished, leaving Clara alone in the echoing aftermath, the memory of his kiss feeling less like a connection and more like a system error that had now been patched and purged. The silence was no longer empty. It was a deafening, deliberate void. His absence stretched into a week of calculated, weaponized silence. There was no call, no text, not another word to acknowledge what had passed between them. It was a brutal, non-verbal statement, a digital wall erected between their worlds that was far more impenetrable than glass or steel. For Clara, each silent day was a fresh wave of humiliation. He had taken her first real act of desire, the first time she had ever truly reached for something for herself, and had treated it as an aberration to be ignored, an inconvenient piece of data to be deleted. The shame was a constant hot coil in her stomach, a bitter taste in the back of her throat. She replayed the kiss in her mind, but the passion had curdled into a sordid, one-sided mistake. She saw herself as a fool, a naive girl who had misread a moment of shared weakness for something more, and he was now punishing her for it. The daily commute back to Oakland became a pilgrimage of penance. The vibrant, chaotic streets that once represented the cage of her obligations now felt like a jury, their silent judgment harsher than any words. She looked at her mother's frail, trusting face, at her brother's innocent ambition, and felt the secret of her night with Adrian burning a hole in her chest. She was a fraud, a contaminant, who had risked their fragile stability for a moment of reckless, selfish indulgence, with a man from a world that could crush theirs without a second thought. The familiar scent of her mother's herbal teas, a smell of duty and love, now seemed to accuse her, a reminder of the simple, good daughter she had been before she had allowed herself to want something so complicated and destructive. The secret was a poison, and she feared it would leach out and ruin them all. Sleep became a theater of torment, offering no respite from the relentless loop of her own thoughts. Her dreams were a feverish collage of the storm's fury, the shocking heat of his skin under her fingertips, and the cold, dismissive void in his eyes as he turned away in her imagined scenarios. She would wake in the pre-dawn darkness of her small room, her heart hammering against her ribs, the ghost of his touch a brand on her skin. The guilt was an insidious whisper, telling her she had been arrogant. Who was she? A girl who mended broken things, to think she could touch a man so thoroughly shattered. She had approached him not as an equal, but as a project, a masterpiece of grief she foolishly thought she could restore. The act now felt less like a kiss and more like a trespass, a violation of a boundary she had no right to cross. Thousands of miles away, in a minimalist hotel suite high above the electric sea of Tokyo, Adrian was fighting a losing war with himself. He submerged himself in a punishing schedule of meetings and data analysis, a desperate attempt to overwrite the memory of her with the cold, hard logic of his work. But it was futile. Her face was a persistent afterimage on every screen, her scent a phantom in the sterile air, the memory of her trembling response a catastrophic virus in his carefully coded operating system. She had breached a firewall he believed to be absolute, triggering a cascade of feelings he had spent years trying to eradicate. It was a terror he hadn't known since the accident that took his wife, The profound, paralyzing fear of feeling again. His flight across the globe was not a rejection of Clara. It was a desperate, panicked retreat from the man she had briefly resurrected. The tangible consequence arrived without warning, a silent, digital blow. A notification from her bank announced a deposit, a sum so vast it seemed unreal, more money than she had ever seen in one place. It was a full year's salary, designated in the transaction notes with the cold corporate term, discretionary. Bonus, the money landed not as a relief but as an insult. It was a severance package for a connection he wanted terminated. It was a settlement, a payment for services rendered, a clear, brutal message that reduced their shared moment of vulnerability to a sordid line item on an expense report. It stripped the kiss of its terrifying, beautiful significance, reframing it as a transaction between a billionaire and his nanny. The zeros in her bank account felt like a crushing weight, a price tag, placed on her soul, and it was the heaviest burden she had ever carried. As she stared at the screen of her phone, the glowing number mocking her, something deep within Clara began to shift. The tidal wave of shame and humiliation receded, leaving behind the hard, cold bedrock of an unfamiliar emotion, anger. It was a clean, quiet rage, a righteous fury that burned away the fog of her guilt. He thought he could buy her. He thought he could place a value on her first act of emotional courage, pay her off like a problem to be solved. The dutiful daughter, the self-sacrificing girl, would have wept with gratitude. But that girl had died in the storm. The woman who had initiated that kiss, who had met his darkness with her own nascent light, was not for sale. A new, unbending resolve began to form in her core. The money wasn't a gift, it was a challenge, and she was, for the first time, ready to fight back. The anger brought with it a stark, undeniable clarity. She could not stay. She could not continue to walk the halls of his sterile mansion, caring for the daughter of a man who held her in such low esteem. To remain would be to accept his valuation of her, to silently agree that their moment was something that could be bought and dismissed. The thought of leaving Sophia was a sharp physical pain, a tearing sensation in her chest that felt like a real wound. But to stay would be the greater betrayal. It would teach the little girl that a woman's dignity had a price. With hands that were surprisingly steady, she wrote her letter of resignation. Each carefully chosen word was a deliberate cut, severing the invisible thread that bound them, an act of reclaiming her own story from the man who had tried to erase it. Her announcement at home was met with the very reaction she had dreaded. "You quit? Mija, have you lost your mind?" her mother cried, her face a mask of fear and disbelief. "That job was our lifeline." In the past, this emotional appeal would have been enough to make Clara fold, to sacrifice her own needs on the altar of her family's security, but not this time. She met her mother's frightened gaze with a calm she didn't know she possessed. "I will find another way, Mama," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "We will be okay, but I could not stay there. My self-respect is not for sale." The words, spoken aloud, were a revelation, a declaration of a self she was only just beginning to know. It was a terrifying, exhilarating act of rebellion, choosing her own integrity over the familiar comfort of her cage. Leaving the mansion for the last time felt less like an ending and more like a true beginning. The house stood silent and indifferent as she packed her few things, its sterile perfection now feeling utterly alien to her. She left her resignation letter on the cold marble of the kitchen island, next to a small, lovingly drawn picture of a star for Sophia. She walked down the long, winding driveway, the gates closing behind her with a soft, final click. She did not look back. The fear of the unknown was a cold knot in her stomach, a familiar companion. But it was no longer her master. Beneath it, a new feeling was taking root, a quiet, resilient strength. She had walked into that world, a girl shaped by the needs of others. She was walking away a woman who had faced a storm, both outside and in, and had chosen to navigate her own way out of the wreckage. 6 months later, the scent of linseed oil and aged wood was the smell of her freedom. Clara had found a position in a small, cluttered restoration workshop in North Beach, a place of beautiful, organized chaos that was the antithesis of Adrian's mansion. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through a large, paint-spattered window, illuminating the vibrant pigments on her palette. She worked not for survival, but for love, the love of the craft, the quiet joy of bringing a faded landscape back to life. The anger she had felt toward Adrian had long since cooled, leaving not a scar but a smooth, hard stone of self-knowledge in its place. She had learned the difference between mending what was broken and trying to fix what was determined to remain shattered. Her hands were steady, her heart was quiet, and for the first time her life felt entirely her own. The invitation was a ghost from her past, arriving in an impossibly thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the embossed seal of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The Vance Foundation was dedicating a new wing of contemporary art, and her name inexplicably was on the guest list. Her first impulse was to burn it, to watch the elegant calligraphy turn to ash and protect the fragile piece she had so painstakingly built. But as she held the card, she saw Sophia's serious little face in her mind. She realized that true freedom wasn't about hiding from the past. It was about facing it, and discovering it no longer had the power to wound her. To attend was not to seek him out, but to prove to herself that she could stand in his world, breathe his air, and remain wholly, unshakably herself. It was the final, necessary brushstroke in her own restoration. She chose a simple, deep blue dress, the color of a twilight sky, a garment she had purchased with her own earnings. Entering the gala was like stepping into another dimension, a glittering universe of champagne and whispered power plays. She felt no envy, no inadequacy, only a distant anthropological curiosity. She bypassed the crowds, finding a quiet corner in the new wing, and stood before a vast abstract canvas of churning blues and greys, a painting that looked like a storm at sea. She lost herself in its depths, in the artist's raw, emotional honesty. She did not hear him approach, but she felt him. The air grew still, the ambient noise of the party receded, and the familiar, intense gravity of his presence settled around her. He was there, just a few feet away, and the world held its breath. Slowly she turned. He stood alone, a solitary island in the glittering social sea. The tailored perfection of his suit could not hide the profound change in him. The sharp, arrogant edges had been worn away, leaving a man who looked hollowed out, haunted by a grief that was no longer contained. His Arctic eyes, when they met hers, held no coldness, only a vast, desolate landscape of regret. The silence that stretched between them was more potent than any words, a conversation conducted on a plane beyond language. In his gaze she saw a full confession, the admission of his cowardice, the shame of his dismissal, and the devastating acknowledgement of the light he had foolishly tried to extinguish. It was a silent, desperate plea for an absolution he knew he did not deserve. Her heart, once a frantic bird in his presence, beat a slow, steady rhythm. The rage and humiliation were gone, replaced by a wave of clear, compassionate understanding. She saw the two paths that diverged from this single moment. One led back to him, to a life of mending his beautiful, broken pieces, a task that might consume her entirely. The other was the path she was already on, a quieter road of her own making, paved with her own choices and illuminated by her own passions. She held his gaze for a long, final moment, and then she gave him the smallest, most subtle of nods. It was not a promise or an invitation. It was a release. It was forgiveness. It was goodbye. Then, with a quiet exhale, she turned her back on the storm and walked away. Stepping out of the museum into the crisp, cool embrace of the San Francisco night, Clara felt a profound and liberating peace settle over her. The city lights glittered across the dark waters of the bay, a million tiny promises of a future yet to be written. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether he would accept her silent verdict or attempt to rewrite their story. But for the first time, the not knowing was not a source of fear, but of exhilarating possibility. Her life was no longer a cracked and faded canvas waiting for another's touch. It was a fresh, primed surface, and the brushes were finally in her own hand. If this journey of a heart finding its own strength has moved you, I invite you to subscribe, like, and share, and perhaps comment with a story of a time you chose your own light.